Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure today to introduce new faculty at UBC, and Dr. Alex Bigazzi joined the faculty here in July. um, and he is working on a joint appointment between the Department of Civil Engineering and the School of Community and Regional Planning, otherwise known as SCARP. He received his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Portland State University in 2014. He teaches courses in Transportation Engineering and Planning, and his research focus areas include transportation emissions and air quality, active transportation, and traffic management. So great to hear from somebody who might be a future collaborator for some of you guys. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out to hear a transportation engineer and planner talk a little bit about issues that are, I know, very central to what a lot of what's happening in this school. So I am new to UBC, working in engineering and planning on the transportation side of both of those. And how I came at this topic area is for a while I was doing research looking at traffic management strategies and effects on motor vehicle emissions. And from that, I kind of transitioned over into near road air quality. And then for the last several years, I've been looking a lot at travelers' exposure, especially pollution inhalation and uptake by bicyclists and pedestrians. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, uptake of traffic-related air pollution while bicycling and walking. You'll quickly see that I'm focused on the bicycling piece because that's what I've been doing for the last few years, but I'm increasingly looking at walking as well, trying to broaden the scope a little bit, and so I'll be pulling that in. But most of what I'm talking about, especially recent research work that I've been doing, is about bicycling. So to set up a little bit of context and motivation, the Transportation 2040 is our long-range strategic transportation plan for the city of Vancouver. These are 30-year strategic plans for transportation systems that are very common. All major metropolitan areas develop them, and they're typically pretty broad visioning exercises, but they do lay out a set of goals and objectives and then performance measures for the transportation systems. And so you can see here, this is pulled from the Transportation 2040 plan, 3 broad goal areas of economy, healthy people, and environment. And under economy, we have a lot of things related to transportation costs and also the distribution of costs, so equity. Under healthy people, we have active lifestyles, so there's the active transportation piece, vibrant public spaces, that's where traffic safety comes in. And then under environment, we have the primarily emissions and air quality related issues, although there are also some stuff related to green spaces. And so if you look at this document, and it's similar in other cities as well, this similar set of goals, if you look as you move from the goals to the objectives to the performance targets, we start to see that active transportation, an increase in active transportation plays a key role in that. And the Transportation 2040 plan lays out 3 performance targets, 2 of which are related to a focus on reducing automobile trips within the city. And the first goal is an increasing in non-auto mode share. The second one is simply reducing vehicle kilometers traveled, and then the third one relates to traffic safety. So I just pulled out the first target. It was laid out as half of trips by non-auto modes by 2020. We've actually already reached that. And then 2/3 of trips by 2040 by non-auto modes. So that's walking, bicycling, and transit. And so what you see in the figure there is an increase not only in the share of non-auto modes, but also just a total increase in the number of trips with population growth. And so we expect to have a lot more active travelers on the road. And the role, I'm coming to this from a transportation professionals perspective, transportation engineers and planning, and we have a couple key roles in this promotion of active transportation. One is our role in providing more attractive transportation system for active travelers, so our role in increasing mode share, but then also our role in providing a transportation system that is safe, comfortable, and healthy for these active travelers to use. So we don't want to encourage active transportation and then give people a transportation system that is not accommodating. So when we look at promoting active travel, there are a number of different impacts that we can look at and that people are looking at. We can talk about the economic impacts in terms of user costs, also in terms of transportation system costs. It's way cheaper to provide transportation, urban transportation for walkers and pedestrians than walkers and bicyclists than other modes. We talk about community impacts in terms of public spaces. There's broad public health impacts related to displacement of auto trips, so reduced emissions in terms of regional air quality, in terms of the climate change as well. And then when we focus down on travelers' health, there's three main areas that are looked at. And here I'm walking over into Kate Teschke's area because she's been looking at this specifically, is these kind of net impacts of traffic safety changes, physical activity changes, and pollution exposure changes. And in today's talk, I'm just going to be talking about, I want to focus just on this one piece, is effective, the transportation system on pollution uptake by active travelers. So I realize that I'm focusing on a negative aspect of active transportation, but I like to try and state very early on that I'm not saying active transportation is bad for your health. But what I am saying is that from a transportation professional's point of view, there's two different reasons why this is important. One is from a promotion point of view. So there have been a couple surveys that have shown that concerns about air pollution is a stated barrier to some for engaging in active transportation. And for a large number of people, it's a concern for people. So people will say that they are worried about the uptake of air pollution because they can smell the air pollution and they're worried about it. So we have a role in looking at this as a way of encouraging active transportation by saying, you know, we're providing cleaner routes. And then the second piece is, like I was talking about, is we need to, if we're going to encourage active transportation, we need to provide a transportation system that is accommodating. So it's safe, clean, healthy. So we do need to reduce it, even though we know that bicycling is healthy overall, we can make it even more healthy by reducing pollution risks. So the framework, I want to talk about it. This is just to kind of get everyone on the same page. I'm usually not talking to public health people, but we might have some slightly different terminology. So what I've illustrated here is 6 steps connecting motor vehicle emissions to health effects for travelers. So we could talk about the pollution generated by on-road combustion activity, the resulting air quality around a city. The 3 pieces I'm going to focus on are the exposure, inhalation, and uptake of active travelers. So by exposure, I'm talking about exposure concentration, so the concentration of pollutants in the breathing zone air. We combine that with breathing rates or ventilation volumes, then we can talk about the inhalation dose, so how much they breathe in. If we also are looking at how much they're retaining in the body, then we're talking about uptake or absorbed dose, and then finally that's going to connect to health effects. But I'm not going that far. I'm not going to talk about the pollution generating activities or the health outcomes today, but I am going to talk about these 3 pieces, the exposure, inhalation, and uptake. So the way I have this set up is I'm going to do probably about 10-15 minutes on kind of the state of knowledge of this area in general, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific recent work that I've been doing. So first, kind of setting it up with what's known about exposure and dose for active travelers. So talking about bicyclists, the literature on bicyclist exposure concentrations, I finished a comprehensive literature review about a year ago that looked at all the papers that had directly measured bicyclist exposure concentrations. And there was about, I think it was 45 papers that had directly measured them, one of which was done here at UBC by Michael Brower. And they were, I think, looking at they were looking at black carbon. But these are the 7 pollutants that are most commonly measured for bicyclist exposure concentrations. It's similar for other travelers. These are the very commonly assessed pollutants. And what we see, so this isn't an unstudied area. There are a number of studies out there. It's not a ton of studies, but there are some out there. But if we look at the results of them, we see really wide central values that have been measured across the study. So I just picked out the 3 most common ones: ultrafine particles, fine PM, and carbon monoxide. All 3 of those have at least an order of magnitude range that have been reported in these central values of these studies. And that reflects widely different contexts, right? So some are done in Beijing, some are done in moderate-sized cities in New Zealand or North America, and obviously the setting has a big influence on this. The other piece that has a big influence on it is the timing. So the earliest studies dated back to the 70s, where they measured carbon monoxide exposure for bicyclists in Boston. And if you know anything about the evolution of exhaust controls over the past 45 years, it's been dramatic, especially on the carbon monoxide side. So obviously there's a temporal and a spatial influence on the wide range that we've seen in exposure concentrations over the years. So if we look at it a little more specifically, a very common study design we see is modal comparisons of exposure. And I think part of the reason is because a lot of this research has come out of either environmental science or environmental health areas where people are trying to quantify exposure differences by mode. And so very often they'll have a common origin, common origin and destination across the modes, and we'll say, all right, if we make a trip from A to B by these different modes, what is the comparative exposure? What is the comparative inhalation dose, perhaps? Possibly along the same route, or maybe they're allowed to choose different routes, but it's still for a common trip. And from a planner engineer perspective, it's interesting as kind of a scorecard amongst modes, but there's a real lack of variables that we can use in transportation system planning and design, other than encouraging mode shift. Right? So there's not nearly as much analysis of the intramodal determinants of exposure concentrations. Things like traffic volumes, things like facility types, intersection designs, near roadway infrastructure, things like that. So there's not a whole lot of actionable information that comes out of the modal comparisons, but most of them have been these modal comparisons. What are the results of those? So it kind of depends on how the study was set up. So typically, if bicyclists and pedestrians have to travel along the same facility as motorized road users, then the concentrations will be similar or maybe slightly higher because they don't have the vehicle shell to protect them. Whereas if bicyclists and pedestrians are allowed to take whatever route they want between A and B, and especially if they're allowed to use separated infrastructure, they quite often will have lower exposure concentrations than the motorized modes. But it's a somewhat of a mixed bag. One of the intramodal determinants of exposure that has been studied a fair bit is kind of a high traffic, low traffic dichotomy. So people will send bicyclists and pedestrians along a high traffic route and then have some parallel low traffic alternative. And this is summing up about a dozen studies that did that for bicyclists and taking the central values of those studies. And there's a range, but there is a fairly large difference between high traffic and low traffic routes, as you'd expect. So it's not uncommon to see 50 or 100% higher exposure concentrations on a high traffic route parallel to a lower traffic alternative, especially for the pollutants that are more strongly concentrated around the roadway. So fine and coarse particles are a little more dispersed than things like ultrafines and black carbon, volatile organic compounds, et cetera. Okay, so that's the exposure piece. If we take the next step along the chain and we're talking about, we want to look at inhalation doses, then we need to know something about the ventilation rates. So if we expand the scope from the studies that directly measured exposure to look at all the studies that assessed bicyclist exposure, either measured or modeled in some way, there were 57 as of about a year ago. There's been about probably half a dozen published since then. It's a pretty big topic area right now. Of those 57, 2/3 were just looking at exposure, so just looking at concentration differences and not going past that, so not looking at ventilation. Of the other third that did look at ventilation, like I said before, most of them were focused on modal comparisons of inhalation doses. And so they used a fixed ventilation rate for bicyclists to kind of scale up the exposure risk compared to someone in a motorized mode. So of the 19 that looked at ventilation for bicyclists, 16 assumed or applied a constant ventilation rate for bicyclists. So just 3 were looking at how inhalation dose varies amongst bicyclists or amongst trips for bicyclists, depending on their ventilation rates during travel. The other piece of this is that studies that have looked at ventilation for bicyclists mostly aren't directly measuring ventilation for bicyclists. So typically it's calculated or modeled from heart rate measurements, or just modeled based on MET differences amongst the modes. So very rarely is there a direct assessment of variations amongst bicyclists' ventilation on road. For bicyclists, if we compare it to motorized modes, this is the ratio of bicyclists to motorized ventilation rates in terms of volume per unit time. And this is summarizing about 10 different studies that measured it. So some of these didn't address exposure. They were just looking at ventilation rates during travel. And we see in general about 2 to 5 times higher ventilation for bicyclists as compared to people in motorized modes. If we look at pedestrians, is about 1.5 to 3 times. So it's typically pedestrians don't have as high ventilation rates as bicyclists. And then also, I have these organized by the average speed of the bicyclists in the study. So as you'd expect, bicyclists who travel at higher speeds are going to have higher ventilation rates. So this is kind of a cross-sectional picture of that, but also from just bicycle power models, we know that the faster you go, the more you're breathing in, which makes sense. So what that means, these higher inhalation doses, if we combine that with the exposure differences, inhalation doses are consistently higher for active travelers than other modes. So like I said, the exposure differences are kind of a mixed bag, but of the studies that have looked at inhalation dose differences amongst modes, even with sometimes lower exposure concentrations, the higher ventilation rates and slower travel speeds, which leads to longer exposure durations, will lead to much higher inhalation doses for bicyclists and pedestrians compared to other modes. So here on the vertical axis, we have inhalation dose for pedestrian, bicyclists, and bus passengers, basically normalized to auto modes. So a value of 1 would mean they're the same. So bicyclists have about 2 to 5 times, kind of similar to the ventilation differences, 2 to 5 times higher. Oh, yeah. I'm supposed to not point at the screen, which only 6 of you guys are looking at. So bicyclists and pedestrians, 2 to 5 times higher inhalation doses. I'm sorry, bicyclists about 2 to 5 times higher. For pedestrians, their ventilation rates aren't quite as high, but they're the slowest mode, so their exposure durations are longer. So those tend to have the highest. Oh yeah, there we go. Now we're talking. For bus passengers, the higher exposure than auto modes is primarily related to higher exposure concentration due to self-pollution on the buses. So buses tend, because they're diesel buses, and obviously not electric buses, but diesel buses tend to have high in-vehicle exposure to particulates because of the self-pollution from the diesel exhaust. Okay, so exposure is kind of a mixed bag, but once we factored in time differences and ventilation differences, we see that bicyclists and pedestrians have generally high inhalation doses during travel. We want to go a step farther and talk about uptake or absorbed doses. It gets a little more complicated, and there's a couple ways this has been done. A very small handful of studies have directly measured or directly assessed travelers' uptake in some way. So, for example, one study took blood and urine samples of bicyclists after riding in a rural environment and an urban environment, and looked at differences in the concentration of VOCs and VOC metabolites in the blood, and found that, as you'd expect, urban bicyclists had higher concentrations than rural bicyclists. So this is showing that there were significant differences in body levels after riding in different types of environments. Much more recently, some researchers in London used induced sputum to quantify the differences in black carbon deposited on the upper respiratory tract of travelers. And they looked at transit riders versus bicyclists, and bicyclists had more lung deposited or upper respiratory tract deposited black carbon after riding the same amount of time as someone riding on their bus system in London. So a couple studies have assessed uptake, not a whole lot of it, and only asking a few questions, because it's not as easy to do, but it has been done. There's been more studies, probably about a half dozen, maybe a few more, that have modeled uptake for travelers and tried to pull in this ventilation exposure differences and travel duration differences. And almost all of these have used this human respiratory tract model, which is essentially a compartment model that looks at deposition of particulates and absorption of volatile organic compounds in different parts of the respiratory tract, and assessing differences. And the modeled studies kind of mirror the results of the inhalation dose differences. So bicyclists and pedestrians several times higher than motorized modes. Okay, so that was the kind of state of science background that set up and some of the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years. So as Sarah mentioned, I finished my PhD down at Portland State University, and I did some bike research in Portland State because people like bikes in Portland. So it was I like bikes in Portland too. So it was a fun topic to address, and I thought there was definitely a need, especially from the engineering and planning community, to get a little bit more quantitative information about how roadway designs can impact pollution risks for active travelers. So that was the main focus, was to try and get some intramodal roadway factors, roadway determinants of pollution inhalation for bicyclists, and identify some planning and design related mitigation strategies. So how we can design our roads, our transportation systems, to be safer for bicyclists. Part of the motivation for this was our, back then we had released, so I talked about the Vancouver's Transportation 2040 plan. So Portland had just released their long range bicycling master plan, so the 2030 bicycle master plan for the city of Portland. And nowhere in the hundreds of pages document was air quality or pollution an explicit concern, an explicit piece of the development of the master plan, right? So I think it was mentioned twice as this is an issue, but there was just a lack of guidance on, okay, yeah, we recognize it's an issue, but how can we address it? How can we try and mitigate people's concerns and mitigate their pollution risks? So trying to move forward to getting future bicycle master plans to have at least a little bit of specific information in there about what kind of roadway designs reduce exposure. So we put a few instrumented bicycles on the street. This is kind of typical to how these on-road exposure studies are done. We had a bicycle out there with a couple GPS devices, getting location, a couple cameras, GoPros, mounted to the bicycle, cycle computer. We were doing temperature and humidity on road, and then a few other air quality instruments, getting total VOCs with a PID. We had a PM 2.5 electrochemical sensor for carbon monoxide, and then we were taking air samples. We had a sample pump there on the back, and then a stainless steel sorption tube attached to the handlebars, taking air samples of 20 to 30 minute riding segments and then bringing them back to do concentration measurements for 75 different VOCs, traffic-related VOCs. On the physiology side, we're using this BioHarness 3, pointing at it, sorry. This BioHarness 3, which is a physiology monitoring strap. It measures heart rate, but it also has this conductive elastic material where the resistance of the material changes with how much it's stretched. And so by monitoring the resistance in the material, you can get a waveform of expansion of the chest to get breathing pattern. So if you do a frequency analysis on the waveform, you can get breathing rate. But then also the amplitude of the breathing of the waveform relates to the tidal volume. And breathing rate was good, but I also wanted it to get a little closer to the on-road ventilation measurements. So I used an incentive spirometer to calibrate at the beginning and end of each data collection, calibrate the amplitude of the waveform to a tidal volume for each participant. And then by combining that with the breathing frequency, you can just multiply them to get a ventilation rate, so a volume per unit time ventilation rate during bicycling. And in the upper right corner, we used a breath sampling bag to use breath analysis to get some breath biomarkers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that's a SKC breath sampling bag. So we got data all over the transportation network. We were targeting a wide range of facilities because, like I said, I was focused on the roadway factors. So we had quite a bit of bike paths, so basically zero ADT facilities. So ADT is average daily traffic, and you see we got a range up to the biggest arterials were around 40 to 50,000 vehicles per day. So a very wide range of traffic volumes on the facilities that we sampled. In all, it was about 80 hours of data and about 280 kilometers of on-road sampling. And I won't get into the details of the statistical analysis, but for the exposure modeling, so we had a number of roadway variables in there, and then we also had background concentrations that we measured before and after each data collection at a large city park, as well as some meteorological variables. But I'm really just going to talk about the roadway variables here today. And the most interesting piece for me is we found a pretty good relationship between exposure and ADT. So ADT is a pretty ubiquitous indicator of road type used in transportation engineering and planning. So this is a variable that we have. It's probably the most common roadway variable we're going to have after functional classification around a transportation network. So ADT is used, in cities all over the country or all over North America, where it's something that we regularly monitor and we can have it for the whole network. And so this was useful because here's something that you can use pretty directly in network analysis to estimate exposure differences amongst routes, because you can follow ADT on each link of the network. And we found that for carbon monoxide and volatile organic compounds, specified a few different ways, either TVOC or BTEX, depending on how we did it, still it was pretty consistently 2% per 1,000 ADT relationship. So exposure concentrations increased about 2% per 1,000 ADT, and this was robust to a number of different model specifications. And so this is like, I found this exciting because this is something you could directly use to quantify exposure differences along routes. We also looked at it for PM 2.5, and it was lower, as you'd expect, because that's more dispersed than these two pollutants. We also found about 20–30% higher around intersections exposure concentrations. Off-street paths were statistically indifferentiable. Is that a word? Indifferentiable? Indifferentiable from a zero ADT street, which I think makes sense because that's essentially what an off-street path is a zero ADT transportation facility. So off-street paths for the most part were like a zero ADT street. We did an off-street path that went through an industrial corridor, and for VOCs, they were 300% higher than all the other off-street paths, so really high for these industrial solvents. But for carbon monoxide, it was in the industrial area, it was less than 50% higher than the other off-street paths. So one of those instances where it really makes a difference which traffic-related pollutants you're talking about as to how it's impacted by nearby land use. One of the interesting pieces about the off-street paths is we have one off-street path, a quite long one down in Portland that runs parallel to a major freeway. And a lot of people thought that was going to be a high exposure facility, and it turned out it wasn't. It was also indifferentiable from the other off-street paths. And going back looking in more detail, the off-street path, although it's in the right-of-way of the freeway, distance-wise, it's basically a full city block separated from the center line of the roadway. So you have a fair bit of separation there. There's good dispersion characteristics. It's a pretty flat, open freeway right-of-way. And in addition to that, a lot of the path is behind a earthen berm or a sound wall. So the path is effectively shielded from the traffic sources. We also did some parallel path comparison, kind of the high traffic, low traffic comparison like I was talking about before, and looked at, these are all three minor and major arterials, so kind of moderately sized arterials of 20 to 35,000 ADT, compared to low traffic bikeways on the top two or an off-street path on the bottom one. And for all these, we found significant concentration differences between the two parallel paths. So the higher traffic facility had about double the VOC and CO concentrations of the parallel path just a block away. So for the ventilation piece, like I said, we're using the physiology monitoring strap to look at dynamic ventilation over the course of the ride, and we ended up looking at it because I wanted to look at the dynamic ventilation effects. So what I did was I looked at external power output of the bicyclist, so energy transfer to the bicycle in watts, and then looked at ventilation as a function of power output and specified it as a distributed lag model. So you can look at ventilation as a function of power output over the last several minutes. And in that model, up to 2 minutes worth of power output were significant determinants of your ventilation at any one point in time. And the mean lag was about 50 seconds. And what that means is that your ventilation while you're bicycling is not determined by your workload in that moment, but your workload over the last 2 minutes. And around a minute or a little bit less than a minute is kind of the central value of that influence. And I also looked at this related to your heart rate. And for your heart rate, it was only about a 10-second lag. And so if you flip around and look at it from the other perspective, as you're bicycling, you'll have a change in workload, and then your heart rate response will be on average about 10 seconds later, and your ventilatory response will be on average about a minute later. And so this is important for studies if you're going to use heart rate as an indicator of on-road ventilation rate. There's a strong relationship there in a steady state condition, and probably over the course of a whole trip, there's a strong relationship as well. But if you want to look at dynamic ventilation, you got to account for a 40 to 50 second lag between changes in heart rate and changes in ventilation rate. This is important for things like intersections. So concentration is about 20–30% higher at intersections. Intersections also have higher workload for the bicyclists because they accelerate out of a stop. But it turned out that there wasn't a very strong relationship between ventilation and intersections, because the ventilatory response to that extra work to accelerate from a stop was spread out over a couple minutes down the road. So you're out of that kind of high concentration intersection environment by the time the ventilatory response has fully realized itself. So that's kind of good. The other thing that came out of this is that the observed ventilation rates on road were very variable over the course of the trip, right? So we saw a wide range of ventilation as they moved around the network. Particularly if you had stretches where there was a lot of downhills in an area, the ventilation came down to near resting level ventilation, whereas other times it was more than 5 times higher if they're going up a hill, for example. So there really is quite a bit of variation in ventilation over the course of a ride. So breath biomarkers was something I hinted at, and this was interesting. So if you're not familiar with these, the way it works is that the concentration of certain types of VOCs in your exhaled breath are strongly related to the concentration of those compounds in your blood. And it doesn't work for all VOCs. It doesn't work for VOCs that interact with your respiratory lining, for example. So it can't be too water soluble. But this has been shown to work in a number of contexts. And I think it originally came out of the medical field, where they've been using it as kind of a non-invasive screening procedure. And then it's also been used in environmental health as well to look at, to basically assess body levels of VOCs in a very non-invasive way. So one context that hadn't been applied to yet is travelers. And for travelers, the issue for travelers is that it's a high concentration environment, but it's generally a fairly short exposure duration, right? So we wanted to see if this would work as a way to assess body levels, changes in body levels of VOCs over the course of a ride. So that's what we did. We for some of the on-road sampling, we conducted some breath sampling as well. So we had prescribed riding segments where we told them to go along a specific route where all the facilities were similar. So here example is a low traffic road route. We also had high traffic road routes to try and get somewhat similar exposure over the course of the route. We take a pre-ride breath sample, and these are exhaled breath samples. Take a pre-ride breath sample and a post-ride breath sample, and then an exposure air sample over the course of the 20 to 30 minute riding segment. And then look at changes in the breath concentrations and see if they related to exposure differences in the riding and pre-ride conditions. So, so we had, quantifications of VOCs in both exposure air and the breath air of these subjects. So the way we did this was we used just 3 healthy subjects, and so we wanted to get repeated measurements on them to see if they were consistent over different types of routes, high traffic and low traffic, high exposure, low exposure routes. And we also had them ride paired to see, so they had essentially the same exposure conditions to see if the uptake was different. And here's kind of a summary of the type of things that we saw in terms of the breath and exposure concentrations. So these are exposure and breath concentrations both normalized to a large park. So these are essentially background levels. It's about a square kilometer park. It's a fairly large park. And if you look at the local street, which is basically a low traffic facility, and a major arterial, which is a high traffic facility, exposure concentrations on road were higher than the park, and on the larger facility, they were higher than at the lower traffic facility. So that makes sense. And interestingly, we saw that essentially reflected in the breath concentrations. So breath concentrations were highest after riding on major arterials, higher than after riding on local streets. And local streets were slightly elevated over the background concentrations, but really not very much. So changes in breath concentrations were much smaller than changes in exposure concentrations. So we applied some statistical analysis to look at whether the changes in breath concentrations were significantly associated with the changes in the exposure concentrations. And of the 76 compounds that we looked at, 8 came out as a significant statistical association between the exposure and the breath concentrations. And they were all aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene and similar. So a kind of a close-knit family of compounds. And for all of them, we found significant relationships, significantly higher on-road than in background. And these are all also traffic-related. They're known to be a significant part of motor vehicle exhaust. And the elasticity of the relationship, it was about half. So changes in breath concentrations during riding were about half as large as changes in exposure concentrations during riding. And this is reflecting the fact that unlike PM, where you can have deposition, that unlimited amount of deposition is basically proportional to the amount that you inhaled. When you uptake VOCs, there is an equilibrium condition that kind of limits the amount. Once your blood has reached equilibrium with the environment that you're breathing in, you're not going to continue to uptake unless you are also clearing it through some other mechanism. So there's a limited amount of uptake that happens. Interesting, amongst our 3 subjects, and this is not a population-wide perspective, this was 3 subjects that were healthy with a moderate amount of physical activity. The parameters relating changes in breath concentrations to changes in exposure concentrations were not different. So were not significantly different amongst the 3 of them. So the uptake mechanism appears to be similar amongst these 3 subjects. In terms of changes, breath concentrations were significantly higher than after riding on major arterials than the background condition. For local streets, there wasn't a significant change in the breath concentrations. So they did go up a little bit, but these breath concentrations, there was quite a bit of, we'll say, noise in the observations. There's breath concentrations are tricky. You have some losses into water, depending on the ambient environment, because your breath air is extremely saturated with water. And so there's some issues with the measurement, but so there's a fair bit of noise, and basically the signal of the uptake on a low traffic road was too small to be statistically significant in our observations. But it was a significant increase on major arterials. And this is what I was talking about. So if we look at the explained variance in breath concentrations of the BTEX compounds, so this is basically the hydrocarbons that were significant breath biomarkers. If we look at exposure variability over the course of the segment, and ventilation, they combined explained almost half of the observed variance in breath concentrations. So quite a bit of noise that was unexplained by our measured independent variables. But I was interested in taking it back 3 or 4 steps. I was interested in roadway variables, right? So how much of this is determined not by, say, different background concentrations on the days we measured, but how much of it was determined by observed roadway and travel variables. And so I did a multi-stage least squares analysis where we looked at these three variables, exposure variability, and ventilation. So we had directly measured those variables, but then also look at if we had predicted those from roadway traffic, weather, and background variables, and then predicted breath concentrations from those, how much of the explanatory power can we take back to the roadway and traffic variables? And it was a little bit more than half of the explanatory power was related to roadway traffic variables. All right, so they're playing an important role. Obviously, weather, wind is always important. Background concentrations are always important for VOCs. Temperature is important. Those are important, but roadway traffic variables are playing an important role in the body levels of the VOCs after a bicycle ride. So connecting the uptake to physical activity, we found in our study and in the broader literature, I mentioned this, ventilation rates are 2 to 5 times higher when you're bicycling. So for a given exposure condition, the inhalation rate is going to be 2 to 5 times higher as well. For particulate matter, if you look at those modeled, those upper respiratory tract models, we expect PM uptake for a given exposure concentration to also be about 2 to 5 times higher, or maybe even more, because the deposition fraction can sometimes increase with ventilation. Right? So from a particulate point of view, we have several times higher uptake of particulates when you're exercising. For VOCs, like I said before, there's a limited amount of uptake, and there's also the issue of when you are breathing more, the increased uptake is not proportional to the increase in ventilation. All right? So in our observations, and this is supported by some of the clinical studies, the increase in body levels of VOC, even though the breathing rate is 2 to 5 times higher, it was only 1.5 to 2 times higher VOC concentrations after riding. So that's a little bit of good news from for some of the pollutants anyway. It's not quite as bad as it looks from a ventilation perspective. I'm gonna skip over that because we're starting to run short on time, and there's a couple other things I wanted to talk about. So that was most of the empirical work. Since then, I've been doing more modeling work, looking at transportation networks and using some of these data to look at travel patterns that we have and estimating effects on pollution risks. So this is one of the things that I thought was interesting. So if you think about a situation where you have a direct high traffic route from your origin to destination, and then there's some sort of a detour you can take that has a lower traffic alternative, right? So it takes longer, but there's lower exposure to traffic along that route. Well, we'd expect the exposure concentrations to be lower as well, all right? So there's gonna be a trade-off here where the detour has longer exposure duration, but lower exposure concentrations, and which one is the lower dose route will just depend on how much you have to go out of your way. Well, you have the same trade-off if you look at bicycle route choice models. Bicyclists like to avoid traffic, but they're only willing to go so far to avoid traffic, right? So which one they would prefer in terms of maximizing their utility would depend on how far they have to go out of their way. So that, to me naturally raise the question, well, how aligned are these preference trade-offs, preference and dose trade-offs? So will people trade off exposure to traffic for distance at about the same rate as it affects their inhalation doses or not? Right? So this raises the question of what types of transportation network configurations can lead to misalignment of preferences and doses. And on the flip side, in what cases can we just say, well, people through their observed preferences for bicycle routes will naturally minimize their inhalation doses because they like to avoid traffic at a certain rate. So this is the result of making that comparison. So what I did was I took some of our data and some of the other exposure data, as well as a couple different bicycle route choice models. And these models tell us what we call the marginal rate of substitution. So how much, the rate at which people are willing to trade off traffic exposure for extra travel distance along a route. And here are the results. So you see mouse. So you see 0 in the middle, and then you have negative 100, negative 200%, positive 100, positive 200%. So if you're at 0, that means that bicyclists observe behaviors that they will make traffic exposure distance trade-offs at about the same rate as the trade-off exists for inhalation doses. In other words, people will roughly minimize, they'll roughly choose the minimum inhalation dose route in any situation because they're going to make those trade-offs at a similar rate. And the horizontal bars represent, because I looked at a range of different model parameters, so they represent kind of an outer range of what the relationship could be. If we go over onto the left, you're looking at potential over detour situations. So these are situations where bicyclists are willing to accept a lot more additional distance to avoid traffic than the inhalation dose minimizing trade-off would be. And the opposite is on the far right. So on the far right, bicyclists are unwilling to detour from what the inhalation dose minimizing exposure distance trade-off would be. And so what we see is that for mixed traffic facilities of medium and low traffic intensities, we see a rough alignment. So we expect that if bicyclists are presented with a range of route options that have moderate to low levels of traffic intensity, we expect them to choose the minimum inhalation dose route. When we look at a high traffic facility, there's a problem in both directions, potential problem in both directions. So up at the top here, if bicyclists are presented with a shortest route that's on a high traffic facility with no bicycle facilities on it, so no bike lane or cycle track or anything like that, they're willing to go much farther out of their way than the dose minimizing trade-off would be. Now, there might be a shorter option, so they won't necessarily have a higher inhalation dose, but this shows the potential for choosing a non-minimum inhalation dose route when they're bicycling. On the flip side, if you take a high traffic street and you have a bike lane on it, then bicyclists are potentially unwilling to detour from the high traffic route with a bicycle lane on it to a lower dose alternative. Right? So for both high traffic streets with and without bike lanes, there's the potential for misalignment of preferences in inhalation doses. So it's not saying that bicyclists are choosing the wrong route, because bicyclists choose routes for a lot of different reasons. Pollution risks might be one of them, but this is just saying that there are situations on high traffic facilities where there's a potential for misalignment of preferences and doses, and people will not naturally choose the lowest dose route. Another thing I've been looking at is a similar trade-off. Last slide, because I want to get some questions. A similar trade-off for speed. So if you think about when you choose a bicycling speed, there's a trade-off of the faster you're bicycling, the higher your ventilation rate, but also the shorter your exposure duration. Right. So there's another kind of intensity duration trade-off for bicycling speed. And what this is modeling a minimum dose speed, essentially. So at what point there's that optimal trade-off? So we expect our inhalation dose per unit distance to be lowest because we're balancing a higher ventilation rate with a shorter exposure duration. And what's interesting is that the minimum dose speed, which is this black line here, if you remember the earlier slide I showed with the different studies that had measured ventilation rates, and I had the speed on the bottom, this is actually roughly the observed speed of bicyclists. So 15 to 20 kilometers an hour is a very representative urban bicycling speed. And so bicyclists are roughly already bicycling at a minimum dose speed. And I can use the mouse. And if you look, so here this is about 18 kilometers an hour, and we're at a 0% grade there. If you look, the colored region that's a single color is basically up to a doubling of the inhalation dose per unit distance. So over a wide range of speeds, it's roughly minimum. There's a fairly wide flat part at the bottom there. Now, if you go outside of that, if you're, say, training for a road race and you're going over 30 kilometers an hour, you see that there really is a powerful increase, a rapid increase in the inhalation dose per unit distance. But in terms of moderate kind of commuting type bicycle speeds, people appear to be making a roughly optimum trade-off anyway. So that's good. All right. I would like, because we don't have too much time left, I just want to jump right ahead to questions, if that is okay.
I'm sure that's fine, Alex. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks. All right. Who's picking them?
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah. You've shown that you can use heart rate and speed and also sort of your position in a city to represent exposure. Would you be able to use this information to, say, data mine Strava data, or have you looked at that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
sorry, Strava, for anybody who doesn't know, it's an app a lot of cyclists use. You can sort of record your ride on your smartphone or your computer, and then dump it onto kind of a social media site so you can see how much slower you are than the young fit people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. That's actually something I've been looking at. So with a GPS trace, you can do this. The biggest challenge is getting good enough road grade data. So the kind of Google Maps type elevation data is too noisy. You have to do a lot of processing to smooth it out to get a realistic road grade, and it's notoriously problematic at road cuts. So anytime you're going over a bridge, if you have something like LiDAR data, or if you have a digital elevation model, it won't represent the road structure above the cut. And so you'll get a really steep decline and then a really steep ascent. The decline isn't a big deal, but when you go up that ascent, if you don't do a lot of processing, you're going to get a crazy amount of energy and ventilation as you're coming back up. So you can do it. Strava sells aggregated data, but it doesn't have enough resolution to be able to do it at this. So that's more about volumes. I mean, the data are there, so if you have some way of mining it at full disaggregate resolution, you could absolutely estimate dose for all the Strava riders, which is the problem with it is a very biased set of travelers, but still a lot of data.
That was really fascinating, Alex. Thanks so much. Thanks. You actually passed over the slide that I really wanted to see, which is what were the implications for road design? Okay.
Good. So we'll use the questions to go back to the non-question part. So yeah. So one of the things is, quickly, if we're talking about road design, so in any situation we want to provide low traffic bicycle facilities, right? That's the ideal situation, but you can't always, and there are trade-offs to be made on high traffic streets. And this wasn't in anything I presented today, but there are some earlier work we did, and since then there's been about probably 4 or 5 studies that have measured the cycle track. So if you have in a single right of way, you have like Dunsmuir, is that how you pronounce it? I'm new to town. So like the Dunsmuir cycle track, so it's so they're still in the same right of way, but they have their slightly separated lanes. So even 3-meter separations like that, you can have 30-40% reductions in exposure concentrations. So those help, but if you go 1 block off, then you can have bigger reductions in exposure concentrations. All right, and our parallel comparison showed that too. So from a exposure point of view, the low traffic bikeways are kind of are the optimal choice, or fully separated paths, but those are the most expensive to provide. These low traffic bikeways are pretty cheap to provide. The most expensive part is the crossing treatments. So these are good. Cycle tracks are still better than nothing. These are what the city is going to call your AAA, all ages and abilities, best. I got to stop pointing with my hands. The cycle tracks are what the city considers to be the best on-road facilities. The bike lanes, those are going to be, in general, your highest concentration facilities, not because there's anything inherently wrong with a bike lane, but because you put a bicycle lane on a high traffic street. In fact, there are design guidelines that you don't put a bicycle lane on there unless you have a minimum ADT anyway. So it's not the bike lane's fault, it's the fact that they're on big roads. And then for off-street paths, something that it's really important. You have to look at the context, the nearby land use. And if you have an off-street path through an industrial area, you can have extremely high concentrations. So it's something to remember, that it's not all the transportation system. Anything else?
The question was about the use of masks.
So I would not be the best person to. I only know secondhand about this. I've heard it said that they don't really do much, except for larger particles, which are the least of a specific roadway concern. But someone else might know more than I did. Feel free to jump in if someone else knows. Follow up.
Going to a beach or forest, would that help to remove toxin from your body?
Well, any clean environment, and you're gonna clear it out. You know, for VOCs, the lower the environment that you're in, the easier it is to clear it through exhaled breath, for example. So, yes. Sure.
I'm not sure, this isn't really my area and Mike's not here today, but I'm not sure about the evidence on use of masks for cyclists, but certainly the line we tow during forest fire smoke events is that masks make it more challenging to breathe, and that has concern, you know, that's definitely puts the person who's using them at risk of having more difficulty breathing.
Yeah, I realize that I have a photo with someone with a mask on it, and that might have been why you said that. This is from, that's my wife. We were on a bike tour in the Andes, and a volcano had just erupted, and so they were giving out masks for the ash from the volcano, so it wasn't traffic related.
So for my occupational hygienists out there, typically if you're looking at N95 dust masks, unless they're you know, in a controlled environment where they're not moving their faces much and they're not sweating profusely, maybe the N95s will be effective, but in general they're not, especially if you're exercising. The humidity from your breath basically opens up those fibers and kind of disrupts that filtration efficiency. So you know, they're not necessarily recommended for protection against particulate matter, especially if that's your #1 goal, is to protect people from particulate matter. And especially in this case, like you showed, volatile organic compounds will just go straight through. So,
cool. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Audience experts.
I'm going to ask one last question. I assume you yourself are a cyclist.
Yeah. Yeah.
and based on your short time in Vancouver, what do you see that's going right, and where do you see room for improvement?
Yeah, good question. Like I said, those low traffic bikeways. I mean, I assume we're talking about air pollution perspective here. Those low traffic bikeways are very nice. They're low exposure. They're going to be low exposure facilities, and for the most part, there are good crossing treatments of the major arterials. You know, the city of Vancouver not having freeways, it's a mixed bag. There are some pros and some cons to that. One of the cons is that the arterials are busy arterials. So a similar arterial network in Portland and Seattle is going to have lower traffic volumes because more of the auto activity is on the freeway. So in terms of at intersections and things like that, the concentrations are probably going to be a little higher here, although I haven't done any measurements here. On the plus side, you don't have those freeways, which are really high intensity emissions areas. So, like I said, a little bit of a mixed bag. But as a bicyclist, I like the infrastructure. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex.
Great, thanks.